Today on Public Research.
I think Jews practically have to not get sucked into this anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic conversation because we think that once we can convince people that something's anti-Semitic, they'll realize it's bad. Anti-Semitism is like racism is bad, etc. And I think ultimately it's a sort of hair-splitting conversation. I think it would much be better to say, like, wait a second, you think this tiny little country and no other country is a cancer to the world? You're insane. It's the same kind of insanity that drives like QAnon people, and people that think like if you got vaccinated, you're Bill Gates is listening to your thoughts through a microchip. It's insane, and it's evil because you're making cause with people who want to see people slaughtered.
Andrew Koss of Mosaic Magazine joins me to discuss his essay, Jewish Studies Against the Jews, the reemergence of anti-Zionist Jews in the wake of October 7th, and the growing hostility towards Zionism in Israel within the academy. We began the interview by discussing Jewish academics who had been mourning the Nakba on Twitter in the days before our interview, such as Barnett Rubin, who compared the Nakba, Israel defeating several invading Arab armies, to the Holocaust the day before our discussion. It just so happened I was on Twitter and I saw something that directly related to the topic we're going to discuss, Jewish studies, but it really sort of worked me up. I saw this tweet from two Jewish academics. One, I think, is in the field of Jewish studies today. And it was a visceral reaction like I've never really had before. So I should give you background.
Yep.
Some of the people we're going to discuss today, like Shaul Magid, Peter Beinart, I really enjoy listening to these guys, and I really dislike people who are like, any Jew who votes for Biden is a capo. I hate that. I don't think Peter Beinart wants to see Jews hurt. But when you get to people, American Jews, who, as far as I interpret this, look at 1948 and look back and, boy, I wish those Jews would have died. I wish the Iraqi army had just wiped them out. Maybe I'm wrong, but am I being too unsympathetic? And I've seen some of this where I've seen American Jews who are like, I hope Iran hits Israel.
Oh God.
Yeah. And
even I haven't seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually from one member of maybe my favorite podcast. And there's another tweet from Zachary Foster, and he's talking about the Nakba and stuff. And I wonder, how do you feel about that? Am I wrong?
You're not wrong. I mean, look, it's in some ways it's so enraging to me that I can easily turn it out because I'm used to it. I mean, I know Peter Beinart. The last conversation I had with him, he had already sort of made his anti-Israel turn, but he was incredibly kind and generous to me. And he's a nice person. He's very, very intelligent. He's someone who likes a really good argument. I think he's sincere in thinking what he thinks. I don't know about other people. I suspect. Well, I won't say anything about Barnett Rubin because I know a little bit about his work, but not enough. I know I've gotten mad at him before, but I don't remember why. But I think there are all kinds of psychological mechanisms here. And again, I don't want to start psychoanalyzing people that I don't know very well, or even people that I do. But I think there's also a lot of self-delusion. There's a whole category of people who have like fancy degrees in political science or are writers for places like, foreign policy or foreign affairs and are super credentialed. Ian Bremmer, is that his name?
Yeah, he's not Jewish.
He's not Jewish, but he falls in that category. But some of these people are Jews, and they have an understanding of, I think, the world in general and of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that is completely out of whack, in my mind, with reality. It doesn't understand Israel, it doesn't understand Arabs, it doesn't understand Palestinians, and in some way it kind of lacks sympathy for the real problems, the real suffering of Palestinians, because it's so out of the ordinary. But I think there's also, now I'm going to switch to some coming as a kind of student of Jewish history. There are two instincts here, and one is to make conflicts in foreign places all about the things that matter most to you. So you see a kind of Jewish drama. You see Israeli soldiers killing Palestinians. Now, probably what you're seeing of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is through a very narrow lens that doesn't really show you anything, because maybe you're ignorant about war, you're ignorant about the nature of this particular war, whatever. That doesn't matter. There's no doubt that Palestinian children have been killed in Gaza. There's no doubt about that. And that's terrible. And you see that's terrible, and you say, I don't want to have anything to do with that. And that's a natural reaction. And then you come up with, depending on how smart you are and what you're reading, you come up with increasingly complicated and maybe rhetorically brilliant ways of explaining to yourself why that's bad and you don't want to have anything to do with it. And to me, that's a kind of moral failure, because the fact of the matter is we live in a world where violence and warfare are just part of the human condition. And ultimately, it's very hard to avoid a situation, not you personally, but as a civilization, as a country, whether you're Albania or whether you're Zimbabwe or whether you're Israel or Canada, where the use of force isn't going to have to come into play, and you're going to have to take tough moral decisions about it. And that you're going to end up making some wrong moral decisions. And that's kind of the reality of morality. We're talking about nations and peoples. But I can see that you sitting in New York or Washington, D.C. or wherever you are, California, if you don't want to have part of that, that's like very easy. I think there's also a kind of eagerness to deny the reality of evil. So I'll give you, if you don't mind me talking for a couple minutes. The other day I saw this movie. It wasn't very good. I don't even remember the name. It had some famous actors in it. But the point of the fact is that the basic plot is some daring crusading cops find this international conspiracy where all wars are being funded by some bank that makes money off of all, right? And at some point it started ruining what was otherwise a good, action movie for me. Because it's this idea that really it's not, all these wars aren't happening because they're evil people trying to kill each other, or sometimes they're two sort of equally gray areas, the conflict between two people who are both, a little good and a little evil, and they're fighting each other, and they have complex reasons for fighting, and they're killing each other. And, there are all these different reasons for war and conflict to happen, which is, again, always been part of human history. And instead, you can just blame it on some banks making money. Like, banks making money is in some ways, the all-powerful bank that's controlling the world is a little, horrifying. But on the other hand, it's very sympathetic. And in that way, you're denying the actuality of evil, right? Putin isn't invading Ukraine, in my opinion, which I obviously think is correct, because he's upset about NATO membership, where he was provoked. He's invading Ukraine because he thinks it should be part of Russia, and he thinks fighting a war is worth that. And he doesn't really care about the damage that involves. The Palestinian national movement, and I'm not talking about all Palestinians, which would be ridiculous. The Palestinian national movement, whether it's Fatah or Hamas or whoever else, is committed to destroying a Jewish state. And that's very hard for people to understand. So, there's variations about what kind of violence they want to use to achieve it, but that's what they're committed to. And understanding that kind of evil in the world and that kind of hostility is very hard. So you come up with other explanations. And I promise I'll pause in a minute. But the third issue is that there's a kind of Jewish insanity here, that Jews have always been good about being their own worst enemies. Um, if you read parts of the Hebrew Bible, if you read the Talmud, it goes through an elaborate story to quote unquote explain the destruction of the Second Temple, which involves two people getting into a ridiculous argument with one another that eventually brings in the Romans. Um, and I think that speaks, regardless of its historical truth, uh, to some realities of Jewish psychology that who knows the reasons for, but that's the way we are.
So I want to say a few things.
Yes,
One,
please.
and I was saying this the other day, and I was in a Twitter space, and it was mostly Israelis, and this one left-wing Israeli started talking about how she opposed the settlements. And basically all the other Israelis who are mostly like pretty right-wing started screaming at her, calling her traitor. I interjected, and I said, one of the great things about Judaism is discussion, debate, disagreement. And this is not good to just have an echo chamber where people can't discuss these things. And actually, most of them agreed to that. So I actually find it a good thing that you look at a society like Israel. There's a variety. There's people extremely critical of the country. So that's one thing I want to say. The other is the reason I pointed out Barnett Rubin, who's a former academic and an Afghanistan expert, and Zachary Foster is because they're both Jewish academics. Because basically my policy is if a Palestinian wants to say I hate Israel and post I don't, it doesn't bother me. I sort of get it. Okay. They've gone through a lot, and it does not really bother me. But the idea that I could not imagine being in 1948 in a Jewish community and hearing on the radio that there are 4 invading Arab armies that are coming for an IDF, which is apparently 25% Holocaust survivors who literally just came from the displaced person camps. And their literal flag emblem of these combined Arab armies was a Islamic knife cutting through a Star of David. I cannot imagine anybody in that Jewish community saying, boy, I hope they kill them all. That would be really great. It's so unthinkable that it's, I don't want to say traitor, but I don't know what to think. And especially when I think about the validation that, is this the level of, are the Jews going to have to become this depraved to get validation?
I think ultimately that's what people want. And it's also a kind of internalization, right? So now I'm psychoanalyzing away anyways, right? You sort of internalize these things. If you want a really interesting conversation about some of these things, Dan Senor, I don't know if you're familiar with this podcast.
Yeah, I am. I listen to every episode. Yep.
Yeah. So if you heard the one with Yossi Klein Halevi and this other rabbi whose name I don't remember.
That's one of the few ones I haven't fully listened to, actually, so, unfortunately.
Oh, well, because you're asking me these questions, you should listen to it because that's kind of one of the questions they ask. And they're 100 times better at answering this than I am. But, look, first of all, in 1948, I don't think there was a single Jew. I'm sure there was. I say one single Jew, but I think there were virtually no Jews who wanted Israel to lose. And I think that was true of the Haredi community. That was true of the anti-Zionists, the religious anti-Zionists, and it was true of the socialist anti-Zionists. And it was true of everybody. It was true of American Jews who had been including those, especially in the Reform movement, who had been very lukewarm on Zionism until then. I think there was unanimity. And I think that was largely true until sometime after the 6-Day War, when Soviet propaganda started succeeding in pointing in labeling Jews as the aggressors. And now fast forward many decades later. And, I think I see this somewhere in the essay that Jews are too white, whatever the hell that means. Um, they're too privileged, again, whatever the hell that means. And they're too colonialist, which, to me is a load of nonsense, to put it as politely as possible, to aligned with the United States as Israel's the United States to possibly be the good guys. And then they have to go to their conferences and their meetings and stuff like that and see all these people for whom, Israel's anathema. There's no way you can't internalize that a little bit. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing. But now I'll say something else about the Barnett Rubins of the world, and certainly the Peter Beinarts of the world. These people don't want to see Jews slaughtered. I'm sure they don't. Again, I think they just don't want to recognize the reality of that being the only option. They want to believe that there's some way to get by otherwise. And look, that somehow, right? If this conflict is Israel's fault, that's a reason to feel bad. That Israel is our side as Jews, and that makes us feel bad. But on the other hand, it can make us feel good, because if it's Israel's fault, we can do something. Israel can do something. Israel can leave the West Bank. It can, it can tear up some settlements. It can do this or do that. It can end the blockade on Gaza, which wasn't really a blockade or it wasn't a blockade on food or medicine or anything like that. But it can end these things and do something different, and then our problem is solved. And that's a kind of nice reality to live in. But that's not the reality, right? If this is because of Netanyahu's right-wing government that we're fighting this war, then Israel can elect a different government that will make American Jewish liberals happy. But again, the conflict isn't going to be solved that easily.
Yeah, I haven't even seen Peter. Maybe he has. I haven't even seen Peter Beinart ever post anything. Maybe he has anything like this, where it seems like, oh, I really wish the Jews had lost this war against this pretty genocidal seeming Arab invading army. I guess the simple way I'd put it is, and again, I just want to emphasize this. I saw some people saying Senator Schumer is a capo and a Nazi and it's just despicable to say that just because he doesn't like Netanyahu. It's horrible to say that. But, and I know it's rare, but when a Jew says, when Nasser said, I'm going to drive the Jews into the sea, and the person says, and you know what? I wish he had won in 1967. I mean, can we call that person a traitor?
First of all, I don't think we should call anyone a capo. I don't even
Not capo, but can we call someone a traitor?
Well, I'm starting on safe ground here. I didn't even like calling the actual capos. I think you have to have some sympathy for them, too. I also dislike calling people traitors. It's not my business to do. So I'm going to punt on this one.
I totally understand.
But, listen to what Yossi Klein Halevi and this other guy who's very brilliant, who I hadn't heard of before, but is very good on this podcast, has to say. And instead of calling them traitors, let's not call each other names, but let's explain very clearly why their arguments are wrong, right? So I looked at the Barnett Rubin tweet again. He's not saying, and I'm sure if you got him here, and he's probably much better at talking on podcasts than being interviewed than I am. If he wouldn't say, "Oh, I wish they killed all the Jews in the land of Israel," he would say, but so there's the Nakba, right? There's the Holocaust. This horrible thing happens to the Jews, and then there's this Nakba that is the horrible thing that happened to Palestinians, and there are Israelis who deny it, and that's bad. And this way, we can all understand. You suffered, I suffered, and then we can all get along and sing Kumbaya. Of course, that's not even. It's not understanding the historical facts, and it's not understanding what the Nakba is. If you want to understand what the Nakba is, my friend Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour wrote this great article Maybe you can put it in your show notes, on the Nakba. He's an Egyptian intellectual. Unlike me, he reads Arabic. He understands Egyptian intellectual history better than maybe anyone, or better than most people. And he explains not the historical reality of the Nakba, but how this word was used, how it was evolved. That would be really interesting. Barnett Rubin, I'm sure, has no idea about that. So,
Yeah,
yes,
and just to be clear, the word Nakba means catastrophe, and it
yes,
was a
yeah,
catastrophe for Palestinians,
of
and
course.
and they suffered terribly. But yeah, I mean, but to compare it to the Holocaust, as if the Holocaust was the result of some European Jewish state going to war with the, you know, there were 5 Jewish states around tiny Germany, and they all were going to wipe out the Germans, and they lost miraculously. And because they lost, they put them in the concert. I mean,
Well,
but
that's
you
more or less
understand
how
me.
Hitler saw it.
Well, well, that's point. But I think you're
Yeah,
right. I should be
yeah,
more generous. Um,
yeah.
so let's move on to Jewish studies. I'm going to start with Alan Dershowitz. This is from a interview with Alan Dershowitz from a few months ago.
Anti-Semitism. When schools created ethnic studies programs, Black studies programs, Hispanic studies programs, women's studies programs, you know what the worst ones are? The worst ones are Jewish studies programs. Many of the most virulent anti-Israel rhetoric comes from Jewish studies programs. You know why?
Why?
Who are the professors there? They're third-rate Israeli professors who couldn't get a job at Hebrew University or Technion or Tel Aviv University. So they come and they try to get jobs in America teaching in Jewish studies programs. Now, there are so many of them and they're so mediocre that in order to get a job, they have to be a talking dog. And what's a talking dog? An Israeli who hates Israel. So the Israelis who hate Israel tend to get the jobs in Jewish studies departments. And so many of the Jewish studies departments have taken the lead against Israel. I'm in favor of abolishing every single ethnic studies program in America. No Black studies, no Latino studies, no women's studies, no gay studies, no Jewish studies, just studies, history, mathematics, science. That's what ought to be taught at university.
Who's going to teach the Jewish history studies if it's abolished?
Jewish history studies could be part of history, number one. Number two, if you're Jewish, you don't need to study Jewish history at university. You can study it in your synagogue, in your Jewish community center. But
They don't.
Programs.
I played this for the great Brandeis historian Jonathan Sarna. I've been lucky enough to interview him twice, and I played this for him. And to be honest, he looked sad when he saw it, because I think he knew who Dershowitz was referring to as far as the Israelis. Let's just use this as a starting point. What are your thoughts?
As usual, Dershowitz has a good point, but turns up the dial to 100 and talks with authority about things about which he in this case knows little. First of all, it's very hard to get an academic appointment in the U.S. And secondly, most of the leading people in Jewish studies in the U.S. are American born. So his sort of libelous statement about getting the second-rate Israelis is wrong. But the fact of the matter is, we have a lot of brilliant people who are not in the least bit mediocre doing Jewish studies. And I talked mostly in this essay about Jewish history because that's where I come from, and that's the field I know the most. We have lots of brilliant people, and what annoys me, yes, it annoys me that there's a lot of mediocrity. And yes, he's right. You can get away with mediocre by making it anti-Israel. And that's like some of the ridiculous panels at the most recent American Jewish Studies conference that I called out some of them. I had a huge long list of them, which were just sort of mind-boggling. Yes, that's true. If you sort of dress up a panel the right way, you can get a lot of attention to work that is not very scholarly. But what really drove me into the state of anger that made me write this essay was how many times it's people who are quite brilliant who have been on the wrong side of things. Um, and I think not for reasons quite as cynical as Dershowitz makes it out to be. Um, I mean, I also made an effort when I named people in this essay. I tried to only name the people who I think are very good academics. Um, Not good. And I purposefully didn't name the people who I think are mediocre for a couple of reasons. But one reason is I think you get a better point that way. I mean, David Myers is I called him out. He's been a professor at UCLA for a long time. He's written some good stuff. One of his essays about what we call Zionist historiography actually helped me. I went back and looked it up again when I was writing this piece because it's such a useful introduction to that theme. Derek Penslar at Harvard is very, very good, and there are many people who are doing even better work. And it's a shame to see what they're doing. And I think there are many academics who have terrible political judgment and excellent academic judgment. And the problem is that those two streams are being crossed right now. That way.
I think the person that Dershowitz is probably referring to, but I think he's probably gotten the most attention of the Jewish studies professors since October 7th.
He's an Israeli historian, associate professor of Holocaust and genocide
This is Raz Siegel on Democracy Now!
Studies at Stockton University, where he's also an endowed professor in the study of modern genocide. Raz Siegel joins us now from Philadelphia.
Oh, and this is very important. This show was recorded on October 16th, so this is the week after October 7th. The death toll in Gaza, I believe, was only a few thousand in total, and so this is what he had to say.
Professor Siegel, welcome to Democracy Now! Lay out your case.
Thank you for having me. I think that indeed what we're seeing now in Gaza is a case of genocide. We have to understand that the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide from 1948 requires that we see special intent for genocide to happen. And to quote the convention, intent to destroy a group as defined as racial, ethnic, religious.
He seems like a very nice guy, and he supplies a bunch of horrible quotes from Smotrich, Vangvir that happened after October 7th. But for months, the biggest critics of Israel were using Raz Siegel. Even a Jewish Israeli admits you're guilty of genocide. You're like Nazi Germany. I mean, you have no right to really exist. I mean, you've lost that now. I think that's what Dershowitz was referring to. First of all, I wonder what your reaction was to Raz Siegel writing that essay. And let me be clear. There is genocidal language within the far right of Israeli politics. Of just get them all out, just bomb the hell, flatten Gaza. That is true. But I wonder how you reacted to that and what impact you think. Do you think that perhaps donors to Jewish studies departments looked at Raz Siegel and said, you know what, I don't want to be funding the next Raz Siegel?
Okay, so there are a couple things here. First of all, I'm not going to treat the accusation of genocide because it's so absurd and completely detached from any reality. Frankly, I mean, I agree with you about some of these disgusting statements from the Israeli right. I mean, even calling them genocidal is next to meaningless since they're not really tied to any actions. And people talk about flattening places all the time. That's often what happens in the wars, or used to happen until very recently. That happens true every war is a genocide. An earlier version of this article actually was aimed at Omer Bartov and Raz Siegel, who are two Israeli-American professors who have been perpetrating this. It's a lie is actually too nice a word. It's a canard. It's like saying Jews get together and kill Christian children and use their blood to make matzah. It's totally disconnected from reality. Because they're very smart, learned people, at least Omer Bartov is. I have no evidence that Raz Siegel is intelligent. But again, I have no evidence to the contrary either. It's just a canard. But that being said, first of all, Raz Siegel is not a professor of Jewish studies. He's not in a Jewish studies program. He got his PhD from Clark University. I would have to Google and find out who his dissertation advisor was, but probably not somebody in Jewish studies. He's in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is separate, which is part of the reason that I took out this whole thing about Bartov and Siegel and just referred to them passing. But yes, people like him because he's Israeli and he's saying the worst possible things about Israel. And if he was anyone else, there would be shouts of tokenization. There are African-American intellectuals like Len Lowry and John McWhorter and Thomas Sowell, who are all incredibly brilliant people. Forget whatever dialogue you're having about race in America. These are brilliant people who we should be paying attention to no matter what. And, if you drag them out in a debate, you're saying, oh, you're tokenizing minorities, blah, 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 blah. So but when you do it with a Jew, nobody says tokenization. Secondly, this gets Siegel, and here Dershowitz is almost onto something. This gets Siegel a lot of credit. He's famous. And he's famous with the people among whom he wants to be famous. If he said outrageous things that appeal to the right, he could be on, I don't know, Joe Rogan or whatever and Joe Rogan isn't really right wing, but he could be on some absurd right wing podcast. And be a celebrity that way. And we've always had Jews like this. Going back to your traders conversation, way before the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, I think in the early 1800s or late 1700s, this book gets written called the Kniga Kagala, which is the book of the Kahal. Kahal is the Jewish community organization. It's written in Russian by a Russian Jew whose name I think is Yankov Brafman. And he's a Jewish convert to Orthodox Christianity who writes this book, which is about, what do Jews do in their synagogue? Elders get together and come up with conspiracies to take over the world. And this is kind of the blueprint for the Protocols, which gets written about 120 years later, if I'm not too far off in my dates. So this is a long story. I talked about Johannes Peppercorn, who's another Jew like this in my essay. You get a lot of attention. I'm the guy who knows about the Jews' dark secrets, and I'm telling the truth. So I don't know. I'm not in Raz Siegel's head. I don't know what kind of moral perversion leads him to want to do this, but it's very bad. And I think, and I hate to say this, nobody should be giving money to Jewish studies or to Israel studies. Zero. And if I can say this because I'm out of the academy, but I heard somebody else who is currently a tenured professor and is certainly to my left on Israel stuff, but also told me that he agrees with a lot of the stuff that I wrote in my essay, who said the same thing. And he benefits from people giving money to his department. He's been chair of a department. I mean, he benefits, and he doesn't want to say this. And it breaks my heart. I think Dershowitz is wrong. You can't learn everything about Jewish history in synagogue. And I know that there are young people out there, whatever their political beliefs, who are doing really interesting research. And I benefit from people who give money. Don't give money. Give money to give scholarships to Jews who want to send their kids to Jewish schools of whatever denomination, but can't afford it. Those are the funds that you should create. That's the number one priority for American Jewish education. Don't give it to the universities, because if you start an Israel studies program, it could easily become an anti-Israel studies program.
Now, was this partially, like I asked you about the impact of Raz Siegel and what he's been saying, since, and I need to emphasize this, since a week
Yeah.
after over 1,000 Israelis were killed.
Yeah.
And a baby was kidnapped, hundreds of Israelis kidnapped. Is this view that you just expressed, is this new, or did you hold this view before that?
No, I came to this view afterwards. And I think everything I said in this essay were things I had thought about before October 7th, but didn't really come together until afterwards. And then I really got to thinking about it. And then, as you write, you refine your ideas. And I read more and thought about it more. And in some ways, I moderated some of the things I originally wanted to say. And in some ways, like this, I became more extreme. And this is my conclusion. I think the universities in general have become, unfortunately, they're not all bad. And I think it's important to note that, and I say this in one way or another in the essay, most professors, if you read the press, especially the right of center press, you think all professors are, crazy, super woke whatevers, who are telling all their students to overthrow capitalism. This isn't the case. The fact of the matter is, when you get a soundbite from a professor in the New York Times about anything, it is likely to be a hard left soundbite. Because those are the politically active professors who want to be in the New York Times. And certainly on an issue like this, but on other things too. And of course, if you ask a Palestinian professor of Middle East studies, they will be every bit as anti-Israel as Ras Siegel. So there's no balance here. Not that would be the best basis for balance, but there's no balance. Most professors, though, are just huge nerds who are really, really fascinated by some point of history or whatever it is that other people find incredibly boring and just love reading about it and talking about it. And they have kind of generic left of center political positions. But, none of them, very few of them are speaking out about the worst abuses that are going on now.
Yeah, I can just say for my part, and I'm quite fond of the left. I'm going to be voting for Biden, and actually, this show started out most of the focus, and I really think the biggest threat is this what I consider a Nazi youth movement within the Republican Party. Nick Fuentes, the Groypers, and the part of my thing is I think it's an oncoming storm that people really don't fully grasp what's coming. And so I would hear this stuff about the radical anti-Semitism on campus before October 7th. I really rolled my eyes at it, just like, oh, come on. I was like, oh, there are all these Hamas supporters, professors. Oh, come on. And then after October 7th, and then it actually took months. It's like, oh, the guy who's the head of hiring at the Columbia's Middle Eastern Studies Department is a guy named Joseph Mossad, who said that October 7th was awesome.
I just have to add, anybody could have predicted that he would have said that, who followed him.
And he's not the only one. I mean, to find out how widespread, like being an open. Or I remember I heard that Columbia had banned Students for Justice in Palestine. I just heard that. And I said, oh, that seems a little harsh. And I'm ashamed to say, only like last month did I read that they had put out a statement the day after October 7th, literally in words, celebrating killing, for instance, Ruth Peretz, a minor in a wheelchair who could not walk, was shot to death at the Nova Music Festival, and they said, "This is great. This is our martyrs. This is a great day." So I didn't realize how bad it was either. I think it's been a wake up call. Do you remember this controversy over the USC valedictorian?
Yes.
Okay.
I can't say it was one of those things that I wanted to pay more attention to, but didn't because there were 700 other things happening. But yes.
Well, I want to play it for a reason because on Twitter there was this outrage because basically they canceled the speech.
Mm-hmm.
and I guess she was posting on Facebook like she wanted to abolish Israel, she hated Israel, all this stuff. And there was this assumption, oh, they canceled it because they're pro-Israel. And then I watched her interview on CNN. I heard something she said, and then I came to a different conclusion about why they didn't want her to speak. And I want to get your opinions.
He has instilled within me as well. We're stifled and we're subject to hate.
You just brought up a link that was posted through your social media page. I do want to ask you about that since you did bring it up. One of the items in this post calls for the complete abolishment of Israel. Is that a position that you endorse?
If you're asking me if I stand for human rights, if you're asking me if I stand for equality and unequivocal and unconditional right to life for all people, including Palestinians, then I'm not apologetic. I believe in what I believe, and it is because of the people around me that I've met at USC, the classes that I've taken, the professors that I have learned from, that have led me to look at the world in this way. And you know, it's unfortunate that, you know, human rights is controversial.
The reason I'm asking is because that's what the link says.
I think she mentions this, but I think she mentions what her minor was at USC. This is the valedictorian.
The complete abolishment of Israel. Abolishment of Israel is in the actual language. Is that something that you endorse?
So the abolishment of the state of Israel, I'd like to clarify, is abolishment of an apartheid system. It inherently is a system that subjugates Palestinians as dehumanized, and it subjugates Palestinian life as not worth the same as other human life. So when the link says...
So is that a yes then?
She might mention here, but she minored in genocide studies at the USC Shoah Foundation, which I believe may have been founded by Steven Spielberg, who did this amazing project capturing the testimonies of Holocaust survivors into this amazing archive that is housed at the USC Shoah Foundation. And and maybe I'm wrong, but I suspect, well, listen, if they hated her anti-Israel views, I don't think she would have been valedictorian of USC, okay? Like, you know, like a Klansman majoring in sociology who writes all his papers about the inferiority of certain races. Even if he's the best writer in the world, I doubt he's going to be the valedictorian of USC. So what I suspect is not that they disliked her views. They're fine with that. What they were afraid of is, and I think she says it in the interview, and she says in her writing, is she says, I hold these views that Israel should be abolished thanks to my amazing professors at the USC Shoah Foundation. And I think they were afraid she was going to get on stage and say that. And that the donors to the USC Shoah Foundation, like Steven Spielberg, who probably does not want to abolish Israel, would say, should I give another $10 million to so that they can teach more generations of students that Israel must be abolished, whether they teach that or not? That's why I think they canceled her speech. Give me your thoughts on this.
I mean, look, I think we have to get back to a problem that's kind of prior to all these things. First of all, I think genocide studies was a mistake. We can have an argument about Jewish studies and other ethnic studies, but I think they have a kind of logic. But genocide studies is a mistake because I think if you want to understand the Holocaust, you don't need to be understanding other genocides. You need to be understanding German history and European history. And if you want to understand the Armenian genocide, you need to understand Armenian and Turkish history and some Russian history. And if you want to understand some of the things that happened in Africa in the 1990s or what the Germans did in Africa in the turn of the century, you need to understand those histories and languages. So I think it's a bad way to frame things, and I think it leads to a lot of this bad thinking. Wolf Gruner, I just Googled the USC thing. There's Genocide Center. It's run by a guy named Wolf Gruner. I know Wolf. It's been years since we've talked. Not only a nice guy, but a really brilliant scholar whose early work was fantastic. But I've seen him signing on to these most absurd and obscene statements because he's not Jewish. That's the way the trend is going. But look, there's a bigger problem, which is that the job of a valedictorian is not to give a political speech. The job of the valedictorian is to say, here are some experiences I had. Don't you remember the good times we have? Good luck to all of you. Be all you can be. Live your dreams. Blah blah blah. A lot of pat nonsense. And when you get a speaker like that, right away. You can listen to her for 2 minutes on her interview on CNN. What she's going to do is hijack that for anti-Israel speech. And maybe if Israel wasn't the big issue, it would be something else. It could even be an issue. I agree with her. I doubt it, but it could be somebody else, and that could be the thing. And this is what's happening to all our institutions. And it became particularly acute, I think, during the Black Lives Matter, the sort of high point of the Black Lives Matter movement. Which again, saying that it's bad for Derek Chauvin to choke George Floyd to death in broad daylight, that shouldn't be a controversial position, or that he should be punished severely for that. We can have a debate about the nature of race and policing, but there are obviously a lot of really bad things that happen, and bad ways that African Americans suffer from, things that are just not fair. And, these are trying to fix them is a good cause. But all of a sudden you get this situation where every group has to put out a statement about this. And why does every group have to put out a statement about this? If you're a Democratic Party politician, the Democratic Party ought to be putting out a statement about this. If you're a Republican politician, and a journalist is interviewing you, they should say, what do you think about what happens, if it's a week after the killing of George Floyd? What do you think about this guy who was murdered by a cop? Right? That's a fair question. If you're the head of the National Association of Toilet Bowl Makers, you don't need to have an opinion about this. And privately as a citizen, you should, but the National Association of Toilet Bowl Makers does not. And neither does the valedictorian of any university. And until we kind of restore some sort of civic sense about what's appropriate for different situations, we're going to keep having this problem over and over again. But yeah, your explanation about the donors, I mean, I who knows if it's true, but it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, if they really hated anti-Zionist views at USC, I mean, she wouldn't be valedictorian, likely. But on that issue, do you think this is sort of the case right now in America, where you have largely Jewish alumni donors that have helped fund these Jewish studies departments, like, say, a Robert Kraft at Columbia, and maybe they weren't paying that close of attention about what was going on there, and that now maybe it's already happening. Now they're looking, what exactly did my dollars go to? And there's like a closer look, and that this is this like a reckoning moment, do you think, for that field?
I hope so, but I think it's only going to happen as part of a much bigger reckoning moment between Jews and the universities. I mean, most of the Jews giving big donations to universities are giving donations not to Jewish studies, but to other things. I mean, look at Bill Ackman. And there has to be a broader reckoning, and not just with Jews. I mean, hopefully, and I know for a fact, Americans of all kinds, even those who aren't particularly invested in Israel one way or the other, are saying, look at what's happening. Certainly Jews and non-Jews are look at what's happening, and look at what these universities have become, and what has gone so terribly wrong that a movement that is basically an embrace of terrorism is having so much success about young people, even if it's only 3% of the students or 5% of the students. Why is it this that is what is bringing people in droves out to the middle of campus to protest? And why is it that it's so hard for the university's administrators to crack down on this? Whereas if they were saying, deport the illegal immigrants, there wouldn't be a 7-hour conversation about whether or not this was represented bigotry against Hispanics. It would be shut down like that.
Or another example, if, like, let's say the head of the Jewish Studies department had a picture of Baruch Goldstein, the Jewish terrorist who killed Palestinians at the Cave of the Patriarchs.
It was the mosque.
I mean, that would be outrageous.
Yes.
No one would tolerate that for a second, but to say, actually, October 7th was one of the best days of my life. It was great. And that is acceptable, yeah.
And we're going to have a debate about whether or not that counts as anti-Semitism. I mean, it's an interesting debate if it was totally theoretical, but it's absurd here. And, these universities are very expensive, and there's increasingly little evidence that kids are learning things that will either help them with their careers or make them more enlightened, better citizens in the way these things were traditionally understood. And I think there will have to be a reckoning where donors have to think about why they're giving money to the universities. And this is the donor to the history department who wants to give a few $1 million to start a new chair and whatever, knowing that the last chair in French studies is also somebody helping to organize anti-Israel protests or whatever. Parents sending their kids to these universities, and also employers who basically subsidize the universities indirectly as a way of screening people for being good candidates for employment. And if there's that kind of reckoning, things might change.
Let's talk for a second about the student protests. I want to say from the beginning, and I said this over and over on Twitter, just to make it clear, because I would see somebody at a award show would say, ceasefire now. And all these, no offense to them, but sort of Republican Jews would say, Nazi, and blah, blah, blah. And I'd be like, listen, there's a lot of people suffering. A lot of people have died. Okay? That's perfectly reasonable. Okay? You might disagree or not. You want to say end the war? Fine. Ceasefire, think of the children, totally fine. The campus protests, there were no acknowledgments of the hostages. Oh, we want peace for the Palestinians and Israelis. I don't think they were truly anti-war protests. I think that if they got the news that Iran had nuked Israel and wiped out the Zionist entity, I think they would have broken out into literal conga lines. I mean, there's scenes from Colombia where they would surround a Jewish student who they identified as Zionist. And, and some of the student leaders at Columbia said, kill all, no Zionist deserves to live. And when you're shouting, no Zionists on campus, that means 90 or whatever, 85% Jews not welcome on campus. That's my take on a lot of it. Maybe I just wasn't seeing the reasonable ones. What was your take?
So, I mean, I think in some ways I'm a little bit more generous. I think there's a hardcore at these protests that basically in one way or another accept the ideology of Hamas and Hezbollah. I think there are a lot of people who do think they're peace protesters or who just know very little about this situation and are running on sort of low information. But once you get people involved and they're riled up, they'll cheer for anything, right? But I want to say something about the ceasefire business. Because, obviously calling people Nazis and anti-Semites for saying ceasefire now at an award show is over the top and just typical of the state of degraded discourse in America. but it represents a kind of moral idiocy and an idiocy. Sorry for using such strong language about the world, right? So what do you mean by ceasefire now? Let's say tomorrow Israel stops firing. I think Bernard Lewis once quipped, ceasefire means that Israel ceases and they fire, and then Hamas starts shooting rockets the next day, which is inevitable that will happen. There's a ceasefire. It happened during the last ceasefire. What should Israel do then? I mean, you and I.
It doesn't make sense. No, I agree with you, but I understand they see horrible images and they want to end. That's all I'm saying.
But again, this is ultimately a failure of our educational system. I don't expect a lot from actors, only that they shouldn't be using this for political whatever, right wing or left wing. It's stupid. Again, it degrades our society and our shared discourse. But people who are very educated think, let's talk about how to end the war. If you know anything about the history of warfare, you'll know that wars don't end. Usually they end when one side wins and the other side loses. There are a few exceptions in history under very specific sets of circumstances, the Russo-Japanese War, the 30 Years' War, but usually that's why wars end. So when you're saying end the war, you're saying something that's kind of meaningless. I wish we could, stop fighting, get together and talk about it. But because of that, and this goes right back to what I said at the beginning, you're rejecting the sort of tough moral choices that we have to make in the world we live in.
But I totally agree with you. But honestly, I think I look at where we are now, where just calling it genocide that's not a fringe thing now. That is just, it's not yet like New York Times, but like The Intercept, Jacobin, it's just, of course.
Raz Siegel, I'm sorry, either Raz Siegel or Omar Bartov wrote a piece in the New York Times laying out the genocide accusation. So it's been in the New York Times too. But
not in like the regular reporter thing. And they'll just call you. If you don't agree with them, you are a genocide supporter. You are a Nazi. And that's something they really like to do. The Zionists are the new Nazis, which is very perverse. It's a kind of, I forget, Jonathan, Professor Sarna talked about this. I forget the term he used, but it's kind of a inversion that people love, which disgusts me. Let me ask you a question that I think everybody should be asking. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years. We spent over $2 trillion. We killed tens of thousands of civilians with U.S. bombs dropped by U.S. planes. I can't even think of one major anti-Afghanistan war protest, say, after the year 2007. Not even one. Not even one on campus. If I had to do the numerical comparison, the anti-Israel protests since October 7th, I don't know, 1,000 times bigger? I mean, 1,000,000 times? I mean, it's sort of like nothing compared to the Sears Tower. Yet it doesn't involve U.S. troops. I know they'll say, we give aid. But how do you answer that, about why that is?
Yeah, I think there are a couple different components going on here. One is the media. The media basically stopped reporting on the war in Afghanistan after 2007. And I think it was very hard to understand what was going on. It was very hard to understand how badly we were mishandling. And I don't mean in moral terms. I think the war in Afghanistan was totally justified. Obviously, America did some morally bad things, and there are complex moral questions about when you're running a war that's not going to win. Then the deaths become different. The media is covering Israel a lot. If you read, there's a wonderful, brilliant essayist named Mati Friedman who wrote about this years ago and has written about it again. This is like a great story, and they love it. And they have one version of the story that's the narrative, and everything else gets reported by them. So that's part of it. The other part of it is, I think, and again, there are things being written about this. I haven't caught up on some of the latest in-depth reports, but there's certainly money coming in from Qatar and maybe other places as well that is helping to fund and fuel some of these protests. There's certainly money coming from mainstream big charities like the Tides Foundation. Yes, the Soros Foundation, Open Society Foundation, which I know people go berserk with like weird theories about George Soros controlling everything. Obviously not true. Open Society Foundation has done some great things in the past. And it gives money to all kinds of awful things. Again, George Soros is not sitting next to at his office, twirling his mustache and going like this, thinking about. But there's complicated ways this money gets passed around. The Ford Foundation, these things with a lot of money. They don't say, I know, let's give $1 million to fund anti-Israel protests where they harass Jews on campus and wave Hezbollah flags. But they give funds to one group, they give funds to another group that is really a kind of, front group for Hamas. And there are American charities that are literally front groups for Hamas, but that sort of portray themselves as, we're for Palestinian human rights, which they're not. They're against Palestinian human rights, effectively, but they're even more against Israel. And this money gets to them, and then they help fund these things. And I think a lot of this is going to get exposed. And lastly, I think there are professors who are behind it. And some of those professors are in departments that are heavily funded by money that comes out of the Middle East from Qatar and also from Iran. Qatar is the worst offender in this regard, but not the only one. So there's a lot of stuff here. Again, when you say follow the money, people start thinking that there's somebody pulling the strings somewhere. It's not that well coordinated, but I think that is certainly part of it. And the third reason is the Jews are the best target, right? If you're going up against America, a lot of people like America. Everybody likes it. I mean, we don't think of it this way, but in some ways it's the most popular country in the world, which is why all these people are trying to get into America. A lot of Americans like America. It's very uncomfortable. If you go after Israel, it's very easy. People don't know much about it. People only know what they see in the news, and they don't even pay that much attention. It's very easy to say that Israel is bad, and there are very few Jews out there, and we're not as powerful as people think we are. And there's this very long history of targeting Jews for the world's problems.
It's not, I wonder if you see this too, because I consider myself on the left, definitely. I haven't even really looked at the right since October 7th, because I just can't handle looking at all the horrible stuff the Nazis and stuff are doing. I can't handle that when it's already bad enough. On the left, among people who are like, and I agree with them on a lot of issues, healthcare, universal healthcare. I'm so sympathetic, and that's why it hurts so much. It's like, but I noticed this before October 7th. If you look at a show, for instance, like Majority Report, I don't know if you know that, but with Sam Cedar, you should look at it. It's interesting because it's the main host is an older guy named Sam Cedar, is Jewish, but his two co-hosts are these Gentile, rabid anti-Zionists. And actually, I wouldn't even accuse them being anti-Semites, but it is like the only issue they care about, to the point where I heard one of them saying, maybe we should have helped elect, and this is a guy who's like, calls himself a communist. He's like, maybe we should have helped elect Dr. Oz, because he's Turkish, and he might have been good on Israel compared to Fetterman. It's like the only issue. It is the life goal, is abolishing Israel. Do you see that? It's almost quasi-religious, and they absolutely do not apply it to any other country. I can't even make sense of it. What do you think?
So it's like, first of all, I want to just plug an essay that we published at Mosaic. I want to plug two, actually. Maybe if you do show notes, we can put them in afterwards. One is by Martin Kramer about Holocaust conversion. It's excellent. I'll put these in an email. The other is by Tamara Barons. Mosaic is a right of center publication. We've been warning people like you about the dangers of anti-Semitism on the left and anti-Israelism on the left for our entire existence. A few years ago, we published something about an in-depth, deep dive on right-wing anti-Semitism. We asked Tamara to do this. We knew it was bad, but it's even worse. And when they talk about Israel, this is true of Tucker Carlson also now, they talk about Israel the exact same way the left wing does. And there's been some really disgusting stuff. Eric Erickson, who's a right-wing blogger, and I'm like right of center. He's like a real right winger, but he did a great job calling out some of this stuff right after October 7th. Okay, but setting that aside, again, I think it's very easy for us Jews to get dragged into a debate about what is an anti-Semitism. Many years ago, I think in the 1980s, Norman Podhoretz, one of my intellectual heroes, said that Israel has become the world's Jew. I don't know if he was the first person to say that or somebody else, but I think that's the best way to understand this. The Nazi slogan was "Die Juden sind unser Unglück." The Jews are our misfortune, which is not saying the Jews are one of our problems. They're saying the Jews are the problem. And that's what these people are saying, is basically Israel is the problem. It's not one of the problems in the world. It's the problem in the world. There's another famous quote. I recently heard it attributed to Isaiah Berlin, the great liberal thinker. But I don't know, again, who said it first, is that the definition of anti-Semitism is hating Jews more than necessary.
I think it's exactly hating Jews more than absolutely necessary.
Absolutely necessary.
I forget where it's from.
Hating Israel more than absolutely necessary. Look, I love Israel. There are lots of problems with Israel. There are problems. I think their system of government needs a lot of serious reform. You can complain about Israelis being a little bit abrasive sometimes. I don't know if you ever noticed that. There are lots you can complain about. But you can dislike Israel. You can think Israel is a problem. You can think the American-Israeli alliance is a problem. But it's never just that. And can I give you one example, which is a really interesting one? Now we're not talking about political radicals. We're talking about mainstream thinking in the State Department, which is this idea of linkage, which basically says that the Arab world has a lot of problems. America has a lot of strained relations with the Arab world. We have countries that are enemies, like Syria, or very uncomfortable allies, like Saudi Arabia, which is now actually becoming a much better ally, just when we're sort of rejecting them. It's a very weird sort of, it'd be a great romantic comedy if it wasn't so tragic. But it says that all these problems, if we can just fix the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then we can solve the other problems. And all these problems are sort of linked to that. Now, I think most of the people thinking this were not anti-Semitites. I'm sure some of them were. James Baker is one of the great exponents of this theory. People called him an anti-Semite. I don't think he's an anti-Semite. He's the one who said, after the Jews, they don't vote for us anyways. That doesn't make you anti-Semitic. It's hating the Jews, but maybe no more than necessary. But think about this thinking. Now, after this Arab Spring, it became so clear that this was false, right? What has made Arab states want to align with Israel has nothing to do with Palestinians. It's the fact that they see a changing landscape, the rise of Iran, the fall of certain of Saddam Hussein, America changing its foreign policy consistently, in a consistent way under both Obama and Trump. And they say maybe Israel would make good allies, because Israel's a tiny country and the Arab world is a complex, huge, very diverse part of the world with lots of problems all of its own that have nothing to do with Donald Trump or Barack Obama or Republicans or Democrats or Israel. And saying that all these problems stem from Israel, if you think about it now, it's nuts. Reasonable people believed it, but it's nuts. And that looks a lot like anti-Semitism. If you just replace Jew with Israel, or Israel with Jew, it looks a lot like anti-Semitism. We have all these complicated problems. The Depression, we lost World War I, we won World War I, blah, blah, blah. Just blame the Jews. So what do you make of that?
I want to tell a personal story, and if you
Please.
have anything similar, I'd love to hear it. But I've been just startled. I got a direct message from a guy. I'm not going to mention his name. Not Jewish. From Minnesota, Gentile, white, not Palestinian, not Arab, not Muslim. And he was accusing me of just total defamation, just crazy stuff. And I direct messaged him. I said, hey, I'm really confused. I don't like getting in text fights. Why don't we do, and I've spoken to him before, why don't we do a short phone call just so I can understand? Try and be nice. And I got a message back. Just, you think I would ever fucking talk to a fucking Zionist? You're lucky I don't. I'll never speak to you again. I'm blocking you. I'll kick your ass. And it's like, what's so amazing about it is, he wants to take away. Remember when they were chasing the Jews in Dagestan, Russia, at the airport? And they went to the hotel and they said, bring out every guest so we can see which one looks like a Jew. A literal pogrom in our time. And the few Jews of Dagestan, I heard they brought them to Israel, the safe haven of Jews in danger. And this person who's not Jewish, not Arab, not Muslim, wants to get rid of this tiny strip of land that is a safe haven for people like Dagestan, which means his life goal, basically, is so the Jews of Dagestan have nowhere to go and they can be killed. If I held such a position, I would be, I just want to be nice to Palestinians, but don't worry, I care about Jewish safety and all that. And he's not that way. I want to destroy the Jewish safe haven, and any Jew that doesn't agree with me, you're a Nazi, and they're going to talk to you, and we're going to kick your ass. And it's just, I don't even know what the words are. The arrogance, it's just, I'm speechless, but it's so widespread. I don't know if you've had any interactions or any thoughts on that.
Not really, because I've been, I wear a yarmulke most of the time, so people I think self-select a little bit, I've been involved actively and publicly in this sort of stuff from 2014 onward, when I started working at Mosaic, and even before that I was in Jewish studies. Go up to a Jewish studies professor and say this. So I've never had anything that extreme. There's a book, and I think we have to go back to Jewish literature to understand these things, and literature more generally. There's a book called The Passenger. It was written right after Kristallnacht and didn't get published in English. It's a crazy story in itself, just the story of the book, until decades later, so a couple of years ago. So I don't remember the author's name, but go find it if you can. Let me know. And just read it. It's phenomenal. But I think you may have a strange feeling of deja vu reading about this.
It's a Boschwitz novel from 1938.
About Hermann Boschwitz, I think is his name. But he's
Ulrich Boschwitz. Yeah.
Ulrich. Okay. I gave him a generic German name. But he's an assimilated German Jew who his best friend and business partner is not Jewish. His wife is not Jewish. And in the space of 48 hours, he discovers that everybody who was his friend is either now his enemy, or is not his enemy, but isn't going to come to his defense.
But Andrew, this is worse, because I don't even think those Nazis in Germany would say, I'm not anti. The guy who's saying, I'll never fucking talk to you again, you're fucking Zionist, I'm going to, I'll kick your ass if I ever see you, is a guy who would say to me, this guy would say, I would say, somebody posted a meme that said, Israel is the cancer of the world. And this person that I'm referring to, he fancies himself an expert on anti-Semitism in the far right. Mm-hmm. And he would say, that's not anti-Semitic. And he'd say, you're the anti-Semite. You're the Jew, because you're linking Zionism to Judaism, which is and so it's even worse, where they have this view, and then they say, no, you're the anti-Semite. It's just...
Yeah, no, I mean, but this is, look, he's saying that because anti-Semitism is unpopular. He may even believe it himself. But it's a trick. And I think Jews practically have to not get sucked into this anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic conversation, because we think that once we can convince people that something's anti-Semitic, they'll realize it's bad. Anti-Semitism is like racism is bad, etc. And I think ultimately it's a sort of hair-splitting conversation. I think it would much be better to say, like, wait a second. You think this tiny little country and no other country is a cancer to the world? You're insane. It's the same kind of insanity that drives like QAnon people, and people that think like if you got vaccinated, you're Bill Gates is listening to your thoughts through a microchip. It's insane, and it's evil, because you're making cause with people who want to see people slaughtered. And I think we have to meet them there. Okay, fine, you're an anti-Zionist. That's evil. What you call anti-Zionism is evil. You're calling for the destruction of a country with millions of people, Arabs, Christians, and Jews living in it, of lots of different races and ethnicities, and you want to see it destroyed and wiped off the map and replaced with something that will be horrible. Why do you think that?
The difficulty is I wouldn't, and this just, it's simple, I wouldn't say that to Peter Beinart. And I wouldn't say it to Ben Lorber, even though I disagree with them on lots of stuff. I wouldn't say that to a good faith Jewish post-Zionist or anti-Zionist, because that's just different. Related question, and I've been asking sort of all my guests who are experts on this area this question, because oddly it's just not discussed enough. And it's a question I wish people ask young Jewish anti-Zionists more, like Zachary Foster, who's at Princeton, which is, let's imagine a world without Israel, which is what you want, right? Zachary Foster, that's his dream, or Max Blumenthal, or Aaron Mate. This is their dream. No more Israel. No safe haven, no escape. Okay, what's the plan when the Jews of France are in danger? Tiny minority. Or England, or America. What's the plan? It's just not discussed. I'm curious if you have an answer for what would a world without Israel mean for Jews in America or other places. And do you think they think about these questions at all?
No. I think they probably think that Israel is the cause of anti-Semitism, and that there would be less anti-Semitism if there weren't Israel, which is a sort of classic mistake. Before World War I, there was big debate during World War I, among German Jewish organizations about whether they should be trying to defend Jews, basically, and sort of call out the anti-Semites, or just kind of convince people that Jews were not as bad as they thought they were, and maybe even get Jews to change some of their behaviors so that the anti-Semites will stop. And of course, changing their behaviors didn't help. What actually happens is that anti-Semitism begets more anti-Semitism. When did these anti-Israel protests and the anti-Semitic attacks happen? October 8th. It's a reaction. They're excited. They're invigorated. Dave Rich had a column about this yesterday. I think it was first in the Jewish Chronicle, and then which is an English publication, and then the Guardian, which is a despicable publication, but occasionally they publish something reasonable to cover their bases. These anti-Semitism encourages more anti-Semitism. Why do you think Poles slaughtered Jews after the Holocaust? Right? That this goes against the way we think about it. The Holocaust causes people to have sympathy for Jews. The Holocaust teaches you that you can slaughter Jews and get away with it. That's what it teaches you. And this problem for dealing with their Jews is all of a sudden has an easy solution that never really occurred to them before, because you can't just go around murdering people. But wait, you can get away with it. So I think there would be more persecution of Jews because Israel ceased to exist, because Jews would be more vulnerable. But listen, in some ways, it doesn't matter if Israel ceases to exist. What happens to you and me? What happens to the 6 million Jews who live there? Where are they going to go? Who's going to want to take them in? Do you think under those circumstances, people aren't going to say, damn Zionists, get out of my house?
Wait, I got to play devil's advocate, because
Yeah.
but I really do, because this is so
Yeah.
popular.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to hurt the Jews in Israel. We just want a one-state, pluralistic state of equal rights.
Yeah. Name one that you think it would be like. Do you think it would be
I'm
Lebanon?
just playing with. I'm just saying what they say.
And first of all, there are some people who want this, but there are not enough of them. And this is, again, is detached from reality. Hamas is an organization that has a long history and a lot of power. It's funded by Qatar and it's funded by Iran. All of this ultimately goes back to Iran's plan to destroy Israel. And this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a regional war, which is ultimately a war about the future of Islam and the fate of the Middle East, in which Israel has become a kind of symbol. And for Iran, it's ultimately a war against America. So these are the realities. Sure, you could replace it with this one-state paradise, but in reality, that means that either that Hamas and Hezbollah take over. It also means the collapse of Jordan, because if Israel falls, Jordan falls. And it means the slaughter of people. And, the last Arab Christians are going to get killed. They've already been driven out of Gaza and the West Bank by Palestinian rulers. They're then going to get slaughtered in Israel as well. Look what happened to Lebanon. Lebanon fell apart with everybody killing each other. And now it's basically this sort of failed state that is totally in the clutches of Iran. But Iran doesn't have to take responsibility for its economy.
You're telling me that Benjamin Netanyahu and Yahya Sinwar are not going to be co-citizens getting along? They won't be in the stands at the Olympics in the same T-shirt, rooting on the volleyball team? Is that?
You'd love to see it, right? But no, this isn't like that. And also, there's an even deeper reason, which is a harder argument to make, but more complicated, which is that I think nationalism gets a bad rap. This guy named Yoram Hazony tried to defend it. I think a lot of his defense is wrong, and he's gotten more wrong since then. And I've written about this elsewhere. But I think nationalism and democracy are tied together very closely. And states succeed because people have a strong sense of a shared identity. And in America, thank God, we're this very unique place that anyone can be an American, right? There's somebody, I can't remember who he is, but says, I don't think of immigrants as people who come here and try to become Americans. I think they're Americans who are born in the wrong place who then come here, right? Anyone can become an American. You could be this is why we have Italian Americans and Irish Americans, and it just makes America more great, if you ask me. But other countries, no. Slovakia works to the extent that Slovakia works. This terrible thing just happened because people have a shared sense of Slovakianness, and this is what holds them together. They have a language and a heritage and a history, and this is why they were able to make a country that never existed in all of history before 1990, whatever it was. And now there's Slovakia, and it's a pretty stable place, except for this assassination.
I do want to acknowledge that, I feel like we might be painting Israel, and I don't want to give short shrift to people who point out a lot of the difficulties that Palestinians find themselves, okay?
Of course.
Yeah, and I don't think you want to either. And personally, I think there is something that is not sustainable about having such a large population that is sort of dominated by the results of elections that they can't necessarily vote in. And so I just want to acknowledge that. I want to just read something from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency in 1933. August 13th, 1933. The title is Dr. Max Neumann, still loyal to Nazi oppressors of his race, hit Zionists and Eastern Jews. This is a quote from him. Unwilling to slough off their Oriental traits, they are a disturbing factor to us who are bound to the soil. Dr. Neumann scored the Zionists for their retention of Jewish customs and their unquenchable desire to create a Jewish nation. How foolish. He declared they were intrinsically traitors to the country in which they lived. On this basis, he supported Nazi action against the famous scientist Albert Einstein because he is a Zionist. Anyways, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah.
You've written this really in-depth essay on Jewish studies. It's titled Jewish Studies Against the Jews, and it's in Mosaic magazine. I mean, there's no way that we're going to be able to go through all of this because you literally start many centuries ago. Though I think it considering where we started in our discussion, if you'd like, I think it would be good maybe to discuss some of those converts that you discussed early in the article, and then maybe we can go through it and touch on a few different names, if you don't mind.
Sure. You want me to start with Johannes Reuchlin?
Wherever you like, but that would be great. Yeah.
So he's a Jew. I don't even remember his century. I have to go to my own article to check. But he's a Jew who converts to Christianity, and then he's one of these people like Yankov Brafman who starts. I said Reuchlin. I'm so sorry. I've totally, and I made this mistake sooner. I've just defamed a great man, Pfefferkorn. It's Pfefferkorn who do you have it in front of you? Yeah, it's Pfefferkorn who converts to Christianity and writes a book defaming the Jews, and people love this. He's not the first one like this, but he understands Hebrew, he knows about their weird Talmudic rituals, and the Jews are bad. And then this guy Johannes Reuchlin, who may be one of the most brilliant people of his era, the great Renaissance humanist moment, who knows Hebrew and like 700 other languages, and is one of the most learned men in Europe. Incidentally, there's a guy named Tony Grafton, who may be one of the most learned men in America, who's currently writing a book about him. But Johannes Reuchlin goes out to defend the Jews, and in that way, Jewish studies, I think, has a kind of connection to the defense of the Jews. That on the one hand, you want it to be an abstract academic, quote unquote, scientific endeavor like any other, but it's not, and it can't be. And that doesn't mean that we can't have different people from different political opinions and writing about Jewish studies. It doesn't mean that we can't have non-Jews in Jewish studies. I think we could use having more non-Jews in the field of Jewish studies. I think it would be good if there are people who really learn the stuff that's necessary for them to do the research they're doing. I think of Marcus Mosley, who's an example of that. The late Robert King of Texas, one of the Texas universities, I don't remember which one, who's a non-Jew who got into Jewish studies and knew a lot and was fantastic. But it means that we sort of can't lose sight about that. And ultimately, I mean, I'm going to zip ahead. But the point of my article is that, Jewish studies shouldn't become solely a weapon to attack the Jews and to abandon them. Are there specific people that you want me to talk about?
Yeah, just to be clear, in case some of the listeners are confused.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna butcher the names.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna say the two older figures you
Yes.
mentioned. One of them is a Jewish guy who converts to Christianity and basically says, "Hey, let me tell you all the secrets about these bad Jews." And
Yes.
it's
And just for the record, that's
Yeah.
Pfefferkorn. That's his name. Yes. Go on.
What's his name?
Pfefferkorn.
Peppercorn?
That's close enough. It's pronounced with an F instead. It's
Pfefferkorn.
peppercorn. Yeah.
Okay.
It means, but yes.
And then a figure who is not Jewish, who's prominent, says, you know what? Actually, this guy is full of it. And
Yeah.
actually, he sort of steps in. Right? What's his name?
Reichland.
Reichland. Okay. Just want to make that clear to the listeners. Now, why don't we go up to some of these conference moments you talked about that sort of stuck out to you?
I mean, so there are two things I noticed. So I mean, just to talk about the world of scholarship, because academia is weird. I think the problem with a lot of conservative critiques of academia, it's there by people who don't really understand what goes on inside it, including Alan Dershowitz, who doesn't know a lot about Jewish studies, apparently, and why should he? It's very obscure. So there's the Association of Jewish Studies, the AJS, which is the major association for Jewish studies in the United States. It has a conference every year. I haven't been to one since like 2016 because I've been out of the academic loop. But you sit through all these panels where people read these boring papers that are actually exciting to you. You get to ask them questions, and then you get to schmooze out afterwards and see your friends who you haven't seen in a couple of years. That's what happens. So there are two things. One is this terrible incident, which I started writing this and then started talking to people and realized that it happened, where an Israeli scholar was supposed to give a talk on Israeli humor. All the talks are planned way before October 7th. She switched her focus to talk about Eretz Nehederet, which is the Israeli Saturday Night Live. Except unlike Saturday Night Live today, it's really, really funny. And they've just been fantastic since October 7th. You can Google it and see their things with English subtitles.
I liked Without the World. I like that one.
I think I missed that one. But I have to see it. But yeah, they had some great ones. An interview with the BBC interviewing Yahya Sinwar. I mean, it's dark stuff, but very funny. And so she talks about that. And a guy went after her saying, and I heard the story from someone. I then went to track down several people who were there to hear the story from them, and everybody gave the same version of it. I emailed very briefly with the person who was involved, who didn't want to be interviewed, which is why I want to respect her privacy a little bit. So she talks about this show and October 7th, and basically by doing that, she's implicitly sort of said that Zionism is okay, right? And somebody who's there goes after her and says, aren't you implicitly, basically endorsing genocide and endorsing what Israel is doing to the Palestinians and, all these terrible things. And this means that at a Jewish studies conference, it's become problematic to talk about Israeli humor without first saying, I want you to know that as an Israeli, I'm very ashamed by the Netanyahu government and what it's doing in Gaza, and I'm very upset about the settlements. But we were going to talk, right? I don't consider myself a Zionist, but, and there's always the something or other, but. And I hate that. And, she didn't do that, so she walked into it, and I bet you she's a very left-wing Israeli on the Israeli spectrum. I mean, this is how academics are. But she faints. She faints because, as far as I can tell, it's a very hot, crowded room, and the situation becomes a little stressful, and she has some sort of disorder that causes her to collapse sometimes. It's hard to find an Israeli who can't take the heat. If you know Israelis, it's like, they're not averse to confrontation. But what's sick is this guy, again, this sort of breakdown of our sort of basic social ethics, keeps going after her. After she's collapsed, she gets up again, and he continues until she collapses again. And then they clear the room. There's somebody who has some medical training who gets her to hospital, and she's fine. Yes.
Wait a second. I gotta understand this.
Yeah.
She gives this talk.
Yeah.
But she doesn't preface it by saying, I'm not a Zionist. There's all this bad stuff. That the next person gets up and critiques
So,
her. She faints on stage,
yeah,
and the guy continues critiquing her as she's like
yeah,
laying
yeah,
there.
yeah.
Seriously,
Seriously.
is this
And
on
his
video?
friends,
Okay.
he had like a gang of people with him who like ganged up on her. Um,
Wow. that's incredible. So even within Jewish studies, to be known as a Zionist is it like being a oh, he's a Klan member. Is that, I mean,
no, no,
it's not that bad.
this is extreme. Um, and a lot of people, since I wrote this essay, of all kinds of political leanings, most of them to my left, some a lot to my left, some less to my left, a lot of them who disagreed with certain things that I said in this essay, have told me like I'm right about a lot of it. And that, it's particularly with the conferences, it's the young people. Again, it's the problem, just the problem everywhere, that the liberals don't want to stand up to the far left. They don't want to say, look, I'm with you. I'm in favor of universal health care. And, I hate Donald Trump. And like, I really wish Netanyahu would get voted out. And I don't like what Israel is doing in Gaza. And we should get them to stop the war, blah, blah, blah. But what you're doing is insane anti-Semitism and just an insane hatred of a little country. Nobody's saying that. Nobody wants to have that role. And because of that, the left has taken over. The people in charge of the conference did actually talk to this guy afterwards and reprimand him. But that this could happen shows that a door is opening to someplace very, very bad. And I tried to make clear, I don't think Jewish studies is a lost cause. I don't think the bad guys have won the war yet, but they're going to win if they're not stopped. If things like this are not condemned, if this guy who was responsible for this, I don't want to name him, get people and unleash the hate mobs on him. It's just not worth it. If this guy isn't ashamed of himself, and instead, so a friend of mine asked him, "Are you going back in there into that room to apologize?" Because she saw him outside the room, and he says, "Well, I'm waiting for her to apologize to me." If this behavior
For
is
what? Apologize for what?
for Zionisming.
That's a word?
I just made that up, but I tried to put myself in shoes. I have no clue. But again, this isn't the norm. But the fact that this could happen is getting harder and harder. I think most of the older people in Jewish studies would say I'm a Zionist, but and the younger people are more likely to say I'm not a Zionist. And then there's this other trend. I'm starting to run out of time. I'd rather talk to you, but I have work that I have to do. But I just want to say there's this other trend where it's starting to look a little bit like anti-Semitism, like this thing about the settler colonialists in the American West.
Oh, can we just end? If you have to go, I totally.
Yeah.
Can we just end on the Shlomo Sand and this new thing of saying they have no connection, sort of thing, and maybe Shaul Magid, who I like, but if we could end on that, that'd be great.
Okay, so I'll try to do this in 5 minutes. So Shlomo Sand is a whack job. Very smart, intelligent whack job, but he's a whack job. He writes books like, The Invention of the Jewish People and The Invention of the Land of Israel and Why I Stopped Being a Jew. And he's like this token. He's like Raz Siegel. He's this one guy who thinks these things. And clearly he's working out his own. I mean, look, every Jewish studies professor who's Jewish is somehow working out some like weird Jewish hang up they have. I'm convinced of that. I'm sure I am. I could probably diagnose it. But his has led to very bad things. So this is no connection to any kind of consensus at all within Jewish studies or within archaeology or within any other field except for Middle East studies, which is dominated. I'll say it quite frankly, it's dominated by radical anti-Zionism and by anti-Semitism and by a very certain brand of Arab identitarianism. of which is a complex thing, and there are many, many different kinds. But this is dominated by a certain not good kind. Um, so he writes this, but then you get somebody else called Nadia Abu al-Hajj, who claims to be, I'm just an academic, I'm interested in archives, I'm not interested in politics, which is a lie. You can Google her and see that that's a lie. But she's somebody who's gone into her field of research to find ways to discredit Israel and get praise for it and academic success. And when years ago, you have to Google when it was, I think it was maybe even in the 90s, she was about to get tenure at Columbia. And somebody said, what the hell? Her whole thesis is that all Israeli archaeology is BS because it's made on making up stuff and destroying Palestinian stuff. And there's no real reason to think that the Jews, the people who lived in the land of Israel 3,000 years ago had any tie to the Jews. And nobody thinks this except for radical anti-Semites, of which she is basically one.
The Khazarian, that whole deal, sort of.
Yes, which is also, I mean, look, Arthur Koestler, when he wrote that book about the Khazars, there was some reason to believe it. Now there's no reason to believe it. But even he had to admit that there were a people who lived in Israel who spoke Hebrew and had a religion based on the Old Testament, who then left to other places and brought the Khazars into their religion. There was some kernel of it beforehand. What she's saying is even more radical. Of course, Arthur Koestler wrote that book to go through his own anti-Zionism. Every genetic, archaeological, and historical study showed that that's not true. And also, even the story about the Khazars converting to Judaism, it never happened. But whatever. So this is a radical version of that. So she says, only Israeli archaeologists think that there's such a thing, basically, as Jewish history in the land of Israel. And she can cite Shlomo Sam. Now, she has a student who has a cross appointment in Jewish studies at NYU. So this is a way, if Jewish studies starts embracing people like Nadia Abu al-Hajj, which every student of Jewish studies should have said immediately, this is like giving her a position at Columbia is like giving one of these Nazi race scientists, who thinks that the theory of evolution shows that blacks, Asians, and white people evolve separately, and this is why there's scientific reasons to believe that white people are superior.
I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.